Welcome to Beat the Press. I'm Emily Rooney. Our topics. Fantasy football appears to be all the rage, and everyone wants in on the action, including some media outlets. People magazine takes a stand against guns. The National Enquirer breaks a story about presidential hopeful Ben Carson, and Huffington Post staffers say it's time to unionize. All that plus our rants and raves of the week. Joining me on this week's panel are John Keller of WBZ, Dante Ramos of the Boston Globe, Dan Kennedy of Northeastern University, and Adam Riley of WGBH News. First, you may not be playing fantasy football, but you'd have to be living under a rock not to know it's the biggest gaming scheme to bust onto the scene since the state lottery. Everyone, including the NFL team owners, have a hand in the pie. But so it seems do sports reporters and ESPN in particular. Turn on almost any TV station and you are bound to run into one of these.
It's like the best adrenaline rush ever.
And the promises are nothing short of staggering.
The giant check is no myth, no mirage, no fool's gold.
The fantasy football sites, DraftKings and FanDuel, are now worth about $1 billion, with backing from the NBA, MLB, and even some NFL owners. Not to mention some sports broadcasters.
Right there. Well, Eli Manning, he's been red hot lately.
ESPN's Matthew Berry gives regular tips about which players to include on fantasy teams. But after the launch of an insider trading investigation at the fantasy sites, ESPN is rethinking some of its co-branding.
We can use the ESPN Fantasy app to draft from our phones.
Still, ads like this remain.
Being super rich is awesome.
Also in the game, the venerable New York Times. Despite the paper's call for regulation of fantasy sports websites, the Times offers daily rankings for fantasy football.
These are totally unregulated gambling venues.
Meanwhile, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is about to rain on the whole parade, suggesting that while fantasy sports websites skirt the internet gambling rules for now, maybe not forever.
Clearly is an area that requires regulation. I would suggest both internal regulation by the companies and some form of government regulation.
But as we enter into NFL Week 5, I can predict something awful is going to happen with this. Everybody's going to have their hand in their pie. This little insider trader deal, which they deny, one of the employees of DraftKings, I think it is, made $350,000 betting over at FanDuel. Something worse is going to happen, and everybody's going to wish they had never gotten involved in this in the first place. But I think Eric Schneiderman is correct. What's going to happen is there are going to have to be some rules and regulations. It's going to end up being deemed to be gambling. And then either everybody's in, including the media. I mean, let's just put all the rules aside and just let's make gambling legal on all sports teams, all kinds of betting, because that's exactly what this is.
I am mystified by this whole topic. First of all, I'm mystified in that I've read numerous stories on this, and I say, this is the one where I'm going to understand it when I get to the end of it, and I still don't. But certainly the people who've looked at this say, you know, it looks like sports gambling, it smells like sports gambling, and you know, those of us who are a little older grew up on tales of the hazards of sports gambling. I mean, this is why Pete Rose isn't in the Hall of Fame.
Which is why it's a surprise that the media wants to be in on this, because
exactly. I mean, I think that they should be
tarnishing the image.
They should be covering this aggressively rather than hopping into bed with them.
Dante, I know you wanted. I think we both want to get in.
Go.
Now, what's interesting to me about this particular moment with this particular industry is that there's clearly so much fan interest in it, and it's so woven into the way some fans are using sports broadcasting up to this point that there's, you know, someone has finally figured out a way to monetize this interest. There's so much money behind it that companies that are in this kind of weird gray, semi-legal, maybe it's gambling, maybe it's not, regulatory area are able to participate in, you know, multi-million-dollar ad partnerships with major corporations. I think the fact that that ESPN and others are willing to do so, you know, speaks that things are going to move exactly in the direction that Emily is describing. This is going to end up legal. It's going to end up regulated. Everyone's betting that, and probably the sooner it ends up in that direction, the better.
I mean, why doesn't the New York Times print how the bookies do each week?
But I gotta say,
what's the difference?
I don't. Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, for years, news organizations have been printing the latest line, which is, you know, it's a betting thing. There's always been sports betting. I don't necessarily think it's the greatest greatest thing, but some people
I'm all for
clearly
it.
bring it into sports fandom.
Well, and also one big difference is, I mean, the Times is printing their fantasy updates, and other news outlets are, and these things are legal, not just FanDuel and DraftKings, but all the other fantasy leagues that people have participated in way before FanDuel and DraftKings figured out how to monetize this, like Dante said. I don't have any problem with the Times or any other media outlet providing a guide to people who want to process sports this way. It's not how I like to watch sports or follow sports, but a lot of people do. I think it gets problem.
They're not processing sports, Adam. They're processing gambling. It has nothing to do with who
No,
wins
I'm
the
talking
game.
about how they process fandom, not just watching to see, say, how the Patriots are doing, but watching to see how Aaron Rodgers does for Green Bay because he's your quarterback, and how Julian Edelman does for the Patriots, and how Adrian Peterson does for the Vikings because you've happened to pick them up. That's what I mean. It's a different way of following sports and being a fan, which is not team-centric but player-centric. I do think it's problematic when you have media outlets acquiring stakes in these companies, and then those companies get accused of unethical conduct. I hadn't realized that Fox Sports has a stake in DraftKings. That NBC, that NBC Universal and the NBA have a stake in FanDuel, NBC Universal in particular. And I actually checked a couple stories that NBC did on this insider, de facto insider trading allegation that came out. There was an NBC Sports piece which noted high up that they had a stake in FanDuel. There was an NBC News piece which stuck that way down at the bottom. And I think that's where it's a problem from a media point of view.
Yeah, I would just simply add that, first of all, the media's fascination with fantasy was existent, well before these sites grew up. Fantasy football's been a big thing just among groups of friends and sports fans without any major financial component for many, many years. The media in this day and age is going to go where the money is and where the viewers are, and this is where they are.
Bring back the Loch Ness Monster.
Absolutely, and the squirrel, the water skiing squirrel.
There you go.